My earliest memories of Dad were watching him at the Hayward and Worcester yard. As a child, I would be brought into Bath by my mother on the train from Weller, where we lived, and I would sit and watch Dad as he carved his statues. I remember it was off Walcott Street, and we would go down to the back of the yard, and then we would go up a flight of steps and into the studio, which was sort of up at the back. My father would always be really sort of in rapt concentration, so you weren't sort of supposed to disturb him, because he was always sort of, as the sporting term would be, in the zone.
And if your father was wrapped in concentration in his work in the Hayward and Worcester studios, where did you wait whilst he finished?
He had a little office which was sort of just off to one side, and you could sit there. And there were chairs in the studio itself, or one could just stand and watch and observe, which was always interesting. But as a child, I was probably not quite old enough to really sort of fully take in what my father was doing, as I would have probably only been about 5 when my father moved from the Hayward and Worcester yard to Wellow.
Was it quite a well-lit place? I imagine that he needed quite good light from a window to be able to do his sculptures in the Hayward and Worcester studio.
Yes, I think it was a fairly well-lit place, and there probably would have been electric light, although my father did prefer working under natural light. It was actually was right next to the river, so I think there were windows which looked out onto the river, as well as there being skylights. So it was quite a well-lit room.
And so what time would you usually leave the studio after your dad had finished, or would it really depend on how absorbed by his work he was?
Usually about 5 or 6 in the afternoon. We wouldn't make our visits very long. We would probably only stay for maybe about an hour or so, probably just to say hello and have a cup of tea and just, give my father a short break, and then let him get back to work. And then he would usually take the train from Bath back to Wellow. After it closed, Dad had a studio built out at Wellow, and I then would watch Dad out at Wellow, and he was very, very methodical in his approach, and would work in 2-hour shifts, and I would go into the studio periodically and watch him while he was carving his statues. And he would usually start by creating a model, which he would take a wooden base, which then he would have electrical wire, and then he would create his plasticine, and he would build his model around that, and then from that he would then progress to this full statue. He would have also done a drawing of his statue before he started the plasticine model, and then he would order his stone, and it was a fascinating process to watch, as a 2-ton or 3-ton block of stone would change into this life form. And when I was a child, I was walking up the garden path one time, and I looked in through the studio, and I was with a friend at the time, and I said to my friend, "There's a man inside that statue, and my daddy's going to get him out." And that was how I conceived as a child that was how I thought that what my father was doing.
And I suppose before you saw your father at work, you could hear him at work.
Oh, yes.
What were those sounds like of him working?
Oh, yes. When you were in the house, when you were in the sitting room, which was the room which was adjoining the studio, you could hear him, methodically chipping away, and it was a very sort of comforting sound, really. It was almost like the sound of a ticking clock. and it wasn't sort of rhythmical or anything, but it was, there would be pauses, but it was sort of always the sort of the background to the house, as it were.
Did he ever talk about his work on the Abbey later on? And if so, what do you remember of that?
Yeah, he did speak a little bit about some of the work that he did when he was doing the dove at the top of the west window. He was doing it with great trepidation. He was doing the final work on the dove when it was in situ, and he said that the whole window would move in and out as he was carving it. So it was very, very delicate, very precarious, and a little nerve-wracking, I'm sure. Not knowing whether he was going to go right through the window or not.
Thinking about your name as well, why are you called Matthew? I understand there's a relationship with the Abbey itself there. Yes. Could you explain that for us, please?
Yes, I was born at the time that the statue of St. Matthew was being carved, and so that is why I am called Matthew. I am named after St. Matthew, which is on the west front of Bath Abbey.
Thinking about your dad returning to the Abbey, did he ever return to the Abbey and look at his work in later life and reflect on that?
Yes, he came back later in life and met Lawrence Tyndall on the scaffolding. I think they were actually cleaning the statues at some point, probably in the 70s or 80s. I think my father was photographed by the Evening Chronicle on the scaffolding. And he was invited up by Lawrence Tyndall, and he was glad to get up there. Although he was getting a little older in life, and I think he was a little more nervous about getting up on the scaffolding. But I think he was quite glad to see it. There was one thing I do remember that my father said, which my brother reminded me of. My grandfather, who was classics teacher at Downside, didn't really have a great high regard for what my father was doing, as it was not academic. But I remember my brother saying that he invited his father to come to look at the statues that he had done on the west front of Bath Abbey, and my grandfather stood and looked at the angels in rapt concentration and didn't say anything. And then when he was leaving, my father asked him how he had liked it, and he said that he would think of the angels as his children, which was great news for my father. It was pleased my father a lot to know that it had meant so much to his father. Somebody once asked him what his favourite thing was that he was ever carving, and he always would say it was the thing that he was doing right at that present moment that was his favourite thing. He was always so focused on what he was doing. He would put everything of himself into that one piece of work, whatever it was. And he was a man of a great concentration and great focus and great self-discipline, and that was what made him so successful at his work, because he was able to really give everything of himself to whatever he was doing right at that particular moment. And you can see it in the quality of the work that he produced. It was just he produced a vast quantity of work that will be remembered by everybody.